Hello, this is here from Habitat. Habitat for Humanity Blue Chapter's organizational podcast, released by the Education and Advocacy Department that will host and foster meaningful discourse centered around current events and issues that concern the organization's advocacy of decent and affordable housing. This initiative tackles understanding the problems that pose as barriers to our advocacy, as well as synthesizing possible solutions to them. Enjoy!
Welcome to the first ever episode of the Hear from Habitat podcast. I'm your host, Joaquim Regalado. Thanks for tuning in with us today. We've got a great show lined up for you. Here with us are very special guests. We have Kitchy D. How are you doing, Kitchy?
Hi, I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being on with us. Why don't you introduce yourself to our listeners and just walk us through some of your past work?
Sure. So my name is Kitchy D. I recently graduated from Ateneo just earlier this year under the course Management Engineering. I also took up a minor in Development Management, and in my final year, I served as the president for Habitat for Humanity Blue Chapter. I guess one of the most recent works I've done for Habitat was as a volunteer for Habitat for Humanity Philippines for their youth congress just last month, where I gathered volunteers from campus chapters as well as community members to come up with a collective statement that would drive prioritization for housing from the national government.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kitchy. Here with us also is another MU student. We have Jaime. Hi, Jaime. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. Excited to be here.
Yeah, great. So both Kitchy and Jaime have been or are currently members of Habitat for Humanity Blue Chapter. I'm so happy to have you both here with us today. So let's start off with you, Kitchy. As a former HFH president, I know you have a lot of experience with our theme today, which is homelessness during the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's get to it. Just for the benefit of some of our listeners who might not be as familiar with Habitat or even the Blue Chapter, could you explain a little bit about the organization, what it stands for and what it does?
Sure. Yeah, so in a general sense, Habitat advocates for a world where everyone has a decent place to live in. So if you could imagine the people living without a home, there are a lot of challenges that they face. And more than that, even the acquisition of a house is also difficult. So one thing we stand for is the removal of barriers to accessing decent and affordable housing. So under Habitat Blue Chapter, there are 4 thrusts. So namely, fundraise, build, advocate, and educate. And it's through these collectively working together that they bring young volunteers together to work with and for community members to help them achieve their goals.
A world where everyone has a decent place to live. That sounds great. Does that also ring true for you, Jaime? And is that one of the reasons that pushed you to join and become a member of this organization?
Yeah, definitely. I love the advocacy.
Yeah, I'm actually a new member, and that's one of the reasons why too. And how for you, Jaime? What are the biggest notions or conceptions associated with being a Habitat member that you've kind of come in having? Because for me personally, when I think of Habitat or before I was a member, I thought of building houses, right? As Kitchy mentioned earlier. But obviously we can't do this right now in the middle of the pandemic when we're doing things online. So for this year in particular, what was the experience like for you?
Yeah, so I actually joined the org because of a friend, so Reg, she's a vice president. And she was telling me, despite the lack of builds in the pandemic, they're still working really close with the community to hear their needs and try to solve the problems that the community is facing. And that's what really spoke to me, because it feels like it's more empowering the community and listening to their issues to make the place they live in decent and livable. And that's really what spurred me on to join.
Yeah, cool. That's actually a really insightful thing. Because I know that a lot of people who aren't as familiar with what Habitat does just thinks, oh, we're building houses. But yeah, thanks for shedding light on the possibilities of, bringing our advocacy to the forefront without necessarily having to do that. So we're gonna get into more of what Habitat does, especially during the pandemic. Now I want to talk about some of the economic effects of COVID. So yeah, let's address the elephant in the room. It's been like almost 20 months, coming on to 2 years since the start of this pandemic, and there's been a slew of public health and economic effects. Have you guys noticed this as well in like your everyday lives as advocates for giving everyone a decent place to live? What are some of the things you noticed since the onslaught of this pandemic, Kitchy?
I guess to an extent, at least from my experience in working with the org last year, we were still able to make a substantial impact to our community members, at least given our situations, right? So I mentioned some thrusts earlier. So in terms of fundraising, in a physical setup, we'd have different fundraisers in the campus, but the online setting still gives us a lot of options to continue raising funds. So that hasn't been much of a problem. The biggest, I guess, shift that we've seen is not being able to attend actual builds. And for me and talking to members, this has been, one of the main pulls that would attract a member to continue supporting Habitat. So without physical builds, it becomes harder to engage volunteers and members to support the organization. So I guess in terms of volunteer mobilization, we just have to show them other alternatives to support the mission. I guess some examples would be to contribute to some of the COVID initiatives that the org has been doing, whether it's packing relief goods, even spreading word would be really helpful. So finding these different avenues, even in an online setup, to continue supporting as a volunteer.
Yeah, great. I can see how that would be really challenging, like in terms of volunteer mobilization. What are some of the things that you've guys been able to do in terms of like fundraising or other projects that otherwise would have been a lot easier? Could you like explain some of the things you've had to like pivot and adjust in your initiatives now?
Sure. Yeah, so one fundraiser that we did is called Sulong sa Pagtulong. So we did this really early in the year. It was split into 3 sub-projects, each with its own mission, whether to give sanitary and hygiene products or relief or food to communities. And in total, we were able to raise, if I remember correctly, almost 400,000. So it was within that the finance department really brought out their creativity in generating these funds, whether it's through partnering up with artists to sell their work, partnering up with small to medium enterprises to give them an avenue to share part of their profits, to contribute to our fundraiser, or even directly soliciting from individuals or groups to collectively raise money. So we saw a lot of success in raising money even in the online setup, given the amount of funds we were able to raise.
Yeah, no, I think that's like really amazing. And I actually want to hear your thoughts, Jaime, on this later. But 2 things that you said really hit home to me, which is one is like the sanitary and hygiene products. A lot of times when we do like, when we raise funds for things that people need, it's a lot of food and clothes, right? But I think it was like really important for you to mention or include like sanitary and hygiene products in like your outreach activities. I think that's something that's really important, and it usually isn't as noticed by people who do these projects. Another one is how you were able to tap on to like various streams of income and fundraising. So yeah, SMEs, artists, these are some things that even in like the business side of things, are kind of flourishing in the online setting, right? So I want to hear your thoughts on that, Jaime. Like, as an ME major, I'm sure you know about how businesses tend to pivot online and stuff, and I think it's a really interesting point how Kitchy mentioned, like, we could tap this into our fundraising initiatives.
Yeah, so it's really an amazing initiative. Actually, it's also one of the reasons I ended up joining, because when I was looking at the Habitat website, actually the Blue chapter is the first chapter that's featured on the Habitat Global website because of that initiative. And I think there's a picture of Kitchy there also. So it's really that, like, bringing people together and like raising that much money to be able to help people, that's really inspiring for people. And I really like the fact that it's not just a handout in terms of food or in terms of clothing, because as you mentioned earlier, it's not really something that's sustainable, right? Because those handouts, maybe you'd give them food, they'd be happy for a day or a couple days, and then the food would run out. But if it's something like sanitary or hygiene products, then those have much longer effects, and those are much more relevant given the pandemic. So it really shows that Habitat was able to pivot within the pandemic and really tap into all its resources to make a good solution, at least given that time.
Yeah, that's really cool. I didn't know that, actually. So yeah, you heard it here. Blue chapter is the first one, I think, on the website. That's really cool. Okay, so now let's talk about the beneficiaries of some of these projects that you were able to implement. So when we talk about housing, I think like there's subtle nuances between different contexts. Like, for example, the rural and the urban sectors. Were you able to like account for these in some of your initiatives, or did you take on like a more universal approach to choosing the specific beneficiaries of these projects?
Oh, interesting question. So when we first were ideating our project, of course, the first beneficiary that came to mind was our partner community. So for our viewers or for our listeners that might not be familiar, each campus chapter is typically paired with a partner community or a community that campus chapter is dedicated to help or work with for that entire year. So for our partner community, we really communicated with them to understand their needs at that very moment, and that's how we found out that sanitation and hygiene products were the way to go. With regards to classifying communities between rural and urban, that wasn't really something that came to mind. I think what we were thinking about really was the feasibility of that initiative. So of course, given the online setup, we really said no to sending out volunteers given the high risks of it. So our approach to this project was really partnering with other organizations to help us mobilize our resources so that they could fulfill that project or initiative that we intended to. So what we saw was that there were already organizations that were established that were, preparing meal packs or distributing sanitary products or food, etc. So when we saw that was the main starting point, and we saw the list of barangays or locations that they would serve. And what we were looking at was really, which location is seeing the least support, or alternatively, which location needs the most support right now in comparison to the rest that organization serves. So it was really in terms of who needed help most, not really in terms of where they were situated.
Yeah, I think that's really great that before deciding on things, you were able to like really communicate with your partner community and see where they need. Oftentimes, I feel like people make certain assumptions about what people need. But yeah, I think it's really great that you were able to talk to them and put yourself in their shoes. Yeah, so could you just remind our listeners about your partner community? Yeah, and I'm also interested to know how this partnership came about. Was it assigned to you? How long has this always been like the partner community since the establishment of the Blue Chapter?
So ever since Habitat for Humanity was founded, they were partnered up with a community in Quezon City called Bistecville 4. And we only recently switched out our partner community early this year to Pasig 1, of course, in Pasig City. So the reason for the switch was that Habitat for Humanity Philippines, or as we call them, our mother organization, wanted to rotate the organizations and the partner communities because each organization has their respective capacities given how long they have been operating. So generally, each organization has come up with their respective projects, best practices, expanded their resources, whether in terms of manpower or ability to generate funds. So the circulation or rotation of both organizations and partner communities would also allow for each community to experience the different expertise of their respective campus chapters.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kitchy. I'm really curious to know, Jaime, is this your first year as a member?
Yes, this is actually my first year as a member. Though in high school, I was the head of a Gawad Kalinga chapter.
So you mentioned that also in high school, before joining the Blue chapter, you worked with the Gawad Kalinga chapter. Yeah, could you walk us through how that experience was?
Oh, so it was a great experience. I feel like me and all the other people, because we were from a quite sheltered private high school, so Xavier, it was like a really great experience exposing us to the community and really getting us to interact with them so that we could help them in other ways. So what we did there was, rather than just having builds, we also tried to look at other types of ways that we could help them. So it's really just interacting with the different partners we had in those communities. So we had buddies from that community and then trying to hear their problems and then trying to craft solutions based on that. So it was really insightful, and I think it's a really great initiative similar to what we do at Habitat currently.
I know that you have some experience with like a startup that tackles housing, correct?
Yeah, so we have a startup called Instahomes. And actually, tying back to what you mentioned about people vulnerable within the pandemic, construction has been one of the industries that have been hit hardest within the pandemic. So there's like inflationary pricing, and a lot of the SME real estate developers have been hit really hard, especially even compared to like the larger developers like the Ayalas of the world. So we're trying to help them by helping them digitalize operations. But on the larger scheme of things, it's actually something that's quite troubling, because if the real estate market or the construction market is cornered by much larger players, then that's worse off for housing and decent living for everyone across the country. Because it's an industry we need to be democratized, have low-cost housing, and have these things that would be able to help people live decent lives in these communities.
Oh, cool. So, like, what are some of the things that Instahome does to account for this?
Yeah. So one of the things we found is that within the pandemic, a lot of these companies have been hit really hard. So 70 to 90% revenue drops. A lot of them are losing a lot of money, and then some potentially are thinking about closing. So what we try to do is really help them market themselves more within the pandemic, or give them a platform to reach more customers so that the effect isn't as bad. The reason for this is some of them are too small to digitalize operations themselves, as opposed to like the larger real estate companies that have all the money in the world to be able to do things like that.
But yeah, I just want to commend you on that. It just goes to show that sometimes, like, you as a Habitat member and also as like an advocate of providing like a decent place to live for everyone, like there's so many ways to do so. Like joining Habitat is one of them, but our work doesn't necessarily have to end here, and so we can incorporate that in our other endeavors, whether academic or professional. And yeah, so on that note, I wanna like bring the conversation and zero in more on homelessness, because I know that COVID has affected us like in so many ways, like our healthcare system, our economy. To do this, I want to pull up a quick stat. So we've found that 4.5 million people are said to be experiencing homelessness in the Philippines right now. Let's start with you, Kitchy. Like, given that statistic, what are like some of the main overarching reasons you think that this is?
Yeah, so there are two main things that come to mind when I think of main reasons for homelessness in the Philippines. First being is the housing affordability gap. So if you think of the income of the average Filipino, it's really low when you're comparing it to how much you need to buy a house. right? So I think one thing that's important to point out is that the Philippines has been seeing a lot of economic growth, right? Whether in terms of GDP, and a lot of industries have been flourishing. But when you think about it in the context of housing and land development, when land develops, the properties around it see an increase in their value as well. So if you think about it in the context of people already struggling to buy a house, it gets even harder as our economy develops. So it becomes a real struggle even financially to acquire a house. And we do see some solutions being offered out there by the government and other financial institutions in the form of loans. But even that becomes difficult because, when you think about loans, what people look at are people's backgrounds, if they're able to pay it. So that often means, if they have a job where they're able to raise income to pay off the loans, or if they have property that they can use up as collateral. But if your background is already as someone that is homeless, that becomes really difficult to show to the people you're asking a loan from. So there are a lot of different barriers, whether it's in terms of generating income or securing a loan, that makes it difficult to just even have that first step of buying a house. The second one, I think really paired to this would be the lack of legislation. So, for me and for us in Habitat, we see housing as a basic human right. And when you think basic human right, it's something that all people should have, regardless of their backgrounds. And so I say lack of legislation because I see that there aren't enough laws being passed to ensure accessibility to housing to all Filipinos. So this could come in a lot of different forms, whether it's in terms of regulation of what I mentioned earlier, like land development or land ownership. If that is regulated, that's one thing that could allow for easier access to land that people can use to build houses. Or secondly, maybe even regulating house prices, right? That would, of course, minimize the gap between income and housing. Another angle there is increasing minimum wage or standard of living that would again allow access to housing. So there are a lot of different angles that I believe the government has a big role to play in just passing laws that would, like I mentioned early on, to break down the barriers in accessing decent housing. Yeah, so I guess to sum it up, I would say that there isn't much recognition of the difficulties there that the housing sector is facing, from all sorts of angles that I mentioned earlier. And even seeing this on paper would be a huge step for the people struggling in this area.
I also want to hear your thoughts on that, Jaime, before I chime in.
Yeah, I agree with all the things Kitchy mentioned. And I guess just to add, even when there is legislation, like housing or relocation programs, they're often not done really well because there's a lack of focus on livability in these areas. So, for example, when I was talking to certain homeless people in the past, instead of the housing or relocation projects of the government being something they want, it's something they actively try to avoid. Because usually the government relocation efforts, it does put a roof over your head, but they get put in buildings or housing communities with no water, with no electricity, and in remote areas where they won't be able to get any jobs. So it's really that even if there is a physical house needs to be something that's livable, an area where they can have jobs, where they can live their life generally well. And that's something that's really lacking in legislation or other interventions.
Yeah, I think like all of those things you mentioned, they form this like complex like system that is kind of super daunting when you look at it. But I guess like all of these things just are all the more reason why we do what we do. Right? So Kitchy, you mentioned like where there's sometimes this cycle of like if you have no house, then that makes you like less likely to get help from financial institutions. But also you need a house, as Jaime mentioned, to like increase your quality of life, and that makes you able to increase like your social mobility. So these things are kind of adding on to each other, which is a huge barrier. So given the complexity of these barriers, what are some of the concrete ways that we can help, not just in Habitat, but for maybe any of our listeners who may be students and feel like there isn't much that they can do? What would you say to these people in terms of what they can do to actually help? Yeah, so can we start with you, Kitchy?
So, as students, right, regardless of our courses or our organizations, we all have our different interests and advocacies that we believe in. And so, I think rather than framing the complexity of housing as a barrier, I think it's actually something that could be leveraged, because you can view the importance of housing from so many different angles if you pair up, homelessness to the difficulty in maintaining someone's mental health, or homelessness or substandard housing to water pollution, depending on where that house is situated, right? So there are these different linkages between housing and different advocacies. And I think communicating all these different perspectives would allow housing as a singular advocacy to attract all the different supporters, because you see that whatchamacallit, I'll just use the same word. You see that linkage between all the different advocacies. So you can bring as many people together because you're generally working towards the same cause. It's just that, everyone wins in the long run.
Yeah, that's actually a really beautiful point. How housing isn't just like in a vacuum in and of itself housing, but also how it's tied up into all these things that are necessary for self-determination and for people to flourish. One of which I think is which is actually a big theme nowadays, is health. Because as you mentioned, housing has linkages to all these different advocacies. One thing I notice is that when it comes to staying safe during COVID, one of the things that people say to you all the time is stay at home. But if you're someone experiencing homelessness, then what could you possibly do because you don't have a home to stay in? Can I pick your brain on that, Jaime? What are the other struggles, whether it be in healthcare or anything else, that come with homelessness that you think are easily glossed over by the general population?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, definitely they're much more vulnerable to COVID because they don't have walls to keep them separated from everyone else. And I actually think that one of the things that came to light in this pandemic is they're also vulnerable to the law and to politics. So when there are regulations like everyone needs to stay at home, no one can stay in these public areas, or policemen or barangay tanod start forcibly getting people who are staying in public areas and then putting them in jail or confining them, it actually really affects the homeless people because they don't have anywhere else to go. And that actually also affects them legally because it puts legal issues on their record, for instance, because they had nowhere to go, but there's a law that said that they shouldn't be out in public. So because of that, they were confined, and they have now a legal record that would make it harder for them to get jobs, make it harder for them to get houses, and other things. So it's really a complex issue that taps into other issues. So what I think needs to happen there is the government legislation needs to take into account these especially vulnerable groups. So for example, the legislation no one being able to stay or sleep in public areas should take into account that there are some people that have nowhere else to go, and that's the only place where they could stay.
Yeah, would you like to add anything onto this, Kitchy?
Sure. Yeah, on top of legislation, I do agree that it's really on the part of the government to do something about their current situation. So I think some of the things I could see happening is, when you think of homelessness, right, the lack of shelter. And of course, it becomes difficult when you frame it in the perspective of building everyone houses. Of course, that's going to take a lot of time and resources and planning, where in the pandemic, everything's really fast-paced and anyone can lose their lives each day, given their situation. So I think that the government has to work rapidly in terms of just generally protecting these individuals from the virus, right? And there are a lot of different solutions we see happening around the world, whether it's in terms of temporary shelter, right? The simple act of putting up a tent already helps a lot. So whatever their budget is, there are different sorts of temporary shelters, transitional shelters that people can use or that the government can set up and provide and actively bring people from the streets and into these safe spaces.
That's a really great point. Yeah, I also think that oftentimes when we're talking about public policy, like the homeless sector tends to be swept under the rug, right? So it's so easy to say to like demand compliance when you have these options. And yeah, I do agree that some of these temporary solutions, which may not necessarily be sustainable, but at least for the moment are something that we can do, or something that could like spell the difference between life and death for some people. We're down to our last theme for this episode. And just to tie everything together, we've talked about the barriers. We've talked about framing the barriers as, like different advocacies and their linkages. And now I want to focus on Habitat's efforts looking forward. If you don't already know Kitchy, there's starting to be plans put in place for the resumption of face-to-face classes, right, Jaime? And so we're kind of at an inflection point where we've already kind of adjusted to this new normal, and now there's this looming possibility of having to adjust again. And with that comes another necessity for us as an organization to pivot. So yeah, Jaime, as like a current member right now, what are the things that you think Habitat could improve on when it goes back next year? Fingers crossed.
Yeah. So as a student, I guess I'm really excited about going back face to face. But going towards what Habitat could do better, perhaps, I'm not sure because I haven't been in the organization that long. But just from what I've heard from past numbers, maybe not during Kitchy's year, but in the previous years before that, there might have been a primary focus on doing builds or activities like that, or at least that's the perception of people outside the organization to the organization. So when it goes back to the physical setup and builds become available again, maybe Habitat should do certain things to rebrand its image to focus more on the livability and other aspects of housing as well, and other aspects of making a decent place to live for individuals, aside from just the builds. So that would help it like draw in more different kinds of people, and that would also help it be more effective to the community or partner communities that it has.
Yeah, and how about you, Kitchy? I'm sure that during your last months in Ateneo, you've been like dreaming about having to go back. But now that we're here in this situation, what were like some of the notes or like some of the things that you'd like to give us as a note of advice going back?
That's really interesting. I would say, from when we were transitioning to a physical setup to an online setup, we were trying to bring what we would do. So for example, the builds and fundraisers, and finding out how we can somewhat replicate that experience or those efforts to the online setting. So how I see it moving forward would just be the reverse, in that I have seen Habitat come up with so many different initiatives in the online setting in terms of, educating other people, trying to contribute to the needs of the community other than housing. And we can see that translate into what we can do even more in an online setup, right? So even this podcast could translate into a talk in Leong Hall, or our financial literacy workshops with the community can be brought to them as well, right? So the members of the org have ideated so much for the online setting, and to just actualize it in a physical setup, I think, is something that I personally would really look forward to.
Yeah, so I loved how you mentioned about like the ideation process, right? I think it takes a lot of like creativity and brainstorming and collaboration for an organization to come up with the best ways to carry out their advocacy. So going back, I know that it won't be exactly the same as before the whole thing started. And it's great that you mentioned how some of the things we did do to replicate like past projects can not just be brought back, but also can be like innovated right, to fit these ever-changing needs. Yeah, I personally find that really exciting. How about you, Jaime? Is there anything in particular that you're looking forward to?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to the initiatives that we made in the online setup that were never in the physical setup, and how those would really play out when we shift back. So, as Kitchy mentioned, things like this podcast would be really interesting. It would be really interesting to see how it would go when we switch it back to the physical setup.
Yeah, for sure. And like one of like the recurring themes that I've noticed is that it's really important to have young people such as ourselves who may not be as familiar with like the plight of people experiencing homelessness, and how educating them as well is something that's really important to tackle all these barriers. So yeah, like on that note, if there's one thing that you'd want to say to someone who may not be as familiar, and like if there's like just one thing that you'd want to impart on your peers, what would it be? So yeah, let's start with you, Jaime. So again, like just to reiterate, in terms of homelessness, what's one thing you wish that everyone would know and that you'd think would be like a big thrust for them to be more active in finding solutions?
Yeah, I guess for me, it's that housing isn't just putting a roof over people's heads. It's also really making sure that where they live is a livable place and has decent living standards for them. So it can't just be a roof. They also need things like food, water, electricity, probably decent jobs. And even if it might be daunting to help them with the housing part because it's really expensive to give people a house, there are other aspects to the situation that we would be able to help in, and that might be where people can interject and have projects.
Great. How about you, Kitchy?
Yeah, really agree with what Jaime said. And to add, I think one thing that I've heard from other people is that there's this negative stigma to people experiencing homelessness where, you know, the general public would typically see them as people that are lazy, that are violent, that really have no hope in contributing to society or the economy. And it just honestly breaks my heart that people are viewed that way, because my understanding of it is, you know, as much as they would like to try, whether to get a job, to get a loan, to have their problems be heard, it's really, really difficult. Like, I cannot even imagine how difficult it is. But generally speaking, there are structural barriers that really inhibit these people from lifting themselves up from their current situations. And so I would just invite, you know, the people interested in learning about homelessness to view the different barriers and the difficulties that these people face that are really difficult to get rid of on their own. And so on our part as volunteers and advocates, it's really important for us to raise their voices through our respective platforms so that they could see a better future.
Yeah, perfect. I don't think I could imagine ending this podcast any other way. That was a really uplifting answer, Kitchy. So on that note, Kitchy and Jaime, thank you so much for being with us. This is all the time we've got. Before we head out, would you guys like to promote anything? Like some of your socials, some of the projects you've been working on?
Okay, I guess I'd shout out the startup that we're doing with some friends, so Instahomes, because it's something that's really related to housing, where we want SME developers to really stay alive even post-pandemic, and we think that that'll lead to a better housing market for everyone. I'd also like to shout out the finance department of Habitat.
Yeah, that's a really noble cause you've been doing. We've actually been debating, Jaime, if you're part of the finance department earlier with Nikita. But yeah, because we weren't sure. How about you, Kitchy? Would you like to plug anything?
Yeah, I would say if our listeners aren't part of Blue Chapter, there are still a lot of avenues to support the cause of housing. So I've recently worked with Habitat for Humanity Philippines, and they accept volunteers from all backgrounds. So you guys can just either head to their website or reach out to their emails and just express your interest in helping them, and maybe there's an active or soon to be active project that you can involve yourself in. I would also like to shout out all the members of Habitat for Humanity Blue Chapter. You guys are doing a great job.
Great. And also to our listeners, don't forget to like our official Instagram account at habitat.bc and our Facebook page at facebook.com/HFH Ateneo. Like our social media pages to stay updated on all the new projects of Habitat for Humanity, and also watch out because we're going to have more episodes from the Hear from Habitat podcast soon. Really exciting stuff. So you've been listening to the Hear from Habitat podcast. Have a great week.